Good afternoon, my beloved Gators. It is wonderful to see you today. Hi, my name is Dr. Vida Robertson, and I am the director of the Center for Critical Race Studies. We would like to sincerely thank you for being here this afternoon. On behalf of the fellows, affiliates, students, and community partners of the Center for Critical Race Studies, we would like to thank you for taking out time to critically consider the racial tragedies unfolding in our nation. At an ever increasing frequency, our news and social media platforms document the hideous brutality of law enforcement's callous treatment of African American and Latinx men and women. 1 year ago, we all watched the gruesome murder of Houston native George Floyd through the camera lens of young Darnella Frazier. Her camera opened the mind of America and allowed us to see the criminal lurking behind the badge and shield of law enforcement. The simple fact that since Derek Chauvin's murder conviction 1 week ago, there has been several notable killings, including Dante Wright, Adam Toledo, Micaiah Bryant, and Andrew Brown Jr. And yet we would be naive to imagine that a nation predicated on the notion of racial division and white supremacy would only find racialized violence among the ranks of its police officers. As we dawn yet another Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month beginning just a few days from now on May 1st, our hearts are saddened by the horrific attacks and abuses of our brothers and sisters of Asian descent. As you know, on March 16th, 8 people were killed in 3 different massage parlors on the outskirts of Atlanta. As the mantra of this social justice movement dictates, we must say her name. So rest in peace, my beloved sisters, Zioji Tan, Delina Yan, Soon Chun Park, Yayoung Jun Grant, Chun Cha Kim, and Young A.U. We are reminded of our nation's anti-Asian bias as we witness yet another video of Asian American citizens accosted and beaten each week. As visual images of brutal acts of racist violence inflicted upon Black, Latinx, and Asian Americans continues to grow viral on our social media, mainstream media, and through other screens in our daily lives. And as the public discourse of these traumatizing images persists, we are left with how do we adapt to the new methods of critical resistance and new foundational practices of resilience. We are left asking, how do we respond when we must constantly witness racist violence? In a critical conversation today entitled, A Conversation on the Collective Trauma Amid Viral Racial Violence, Critical Race Studies Fellows Dr. Stacie DeFreitas, Professor of Psychology, and Dr. Felicia Harris, Associate Professor of Communication Studies, will draw upon their field of research and their own personal experiences to explore the ways to hope, cope, and hold space for one another in our new and often discouraging normal. My beloved, at the end of this conversation, we're going to encourage you as audience members to pose questions in the chat for our interlocutors to answer. But without further ado, I give you Dr. Felicia Harris and Dr. Stacie DeFreitas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robertson, for that introduction and for really just setting the context of what we're up against for today. Stacie, I don't know about you, but just even hearing him go through the list of all of the violence that we have witnessed, that we have been talking about, that has been just playing over and over again in our minds over the past few weeks and months, the past year. I feel like it's a little bit heavy. And I think, this is going to be a heavy conversation today. It might be hard to have. I have my tissue. It might be hard for some of our participants to hear. So I want to ask, if you don't mind, could you just lead us really quick in a moment of mindfulness or some sort of reflection to transition into this talk?
Yeah. So let's just take a moment to reflect on all that we've been through in the last year. So we've faced a global pandemic that we're still dealing with, right?
Hmm.
Many instances of racially motivated murders, mass shootings,
Hmm.
political unrest and turmoil. And then the regular stressors of everyday life haven't ended either, right? Many of us are facing lots of new challenges like homeschooling children,
Oh gosh.
um, sickness in our friends, family, ourselves. Some of us have dealt with deaths. Many people have dealt with deaths,
Hmm. Hmm.
deaths of loved ones. And then the regular work and school stressors are still there, right? And because of all these stressors that we're feeling, we really have to give ourselves and others grace. Remember that we're all human. It's okay to not be okay, and it's okay to need help, right? So, right now, what I'd ask everyone is to try to focus on this moment where we're going to really learn about how to take care of ourselves and those that we love. So, I want everybody to put away their cell phones. I know this is a struggle. This is hard for a lot of people to, yes, silence it,
Hmm.
put away your work, and really attend to this moment. Um, what I'd like to ask everybody to do is to just really take a deep breath to center ourselves and put ourselves in this moment. So sit or lay wherever you're most comfortable, right? Feet planted firmly. Make sure you're feeling the ground beneath you or a bed beneath you, whatever. And I want everyone to take in a slow, deep breath through their noses so that you expand your lungs and your stomach, and then breathe out through your mouth. Okay, so let's try to do that all together, please. All right, let's breathe in and then out. And breathing out all those distractions and stressors. And embrace being here with Felicia and I so that you can really focus about thinking about the best ways to take care of yourself and those you love.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. I'm so grateful to be here and to be able to hold space with whom many of you all know as Dr. Stacie DeFreitas, licensed clinical psychologist and author of the now award-winning text, African American Psychology: A Positive Psychology Perspective.
I
But of
didn't pay
course,
her to do that. I didn't pay her to say that.
no, she didn't pay me. But of course, she's my friend. I call her Stacie. She is not only just a good friend, an esteemed colleague, and I benefit daily from her therapeutic insights and her reminders to stop and take a deep breath and just be present in the moment, against all that we're up against and what we're facing right now. But, if I'm honest, even though I say some of my best friends are therapists, I'm also very grateful for my own personal relationship with a therapist that I pay, who bills my health insurance, and who was actually the first person to introduce me to this term, holding space. And I'm communication studies, so I don't want to butcher it or get it wrong. So, Stacie, could you explain to the audience what does it mean to hold space for one another, and particularly in this moment?
Right. So holding space is really about putting all your attention and focus on someone else and
Yes.
supporting their feelings, right? And there are lots of steps to this and lots of different ways this can look. But the most important part of it is really listening, right?
Mhm.
Listening without trying to solve problems, without judging, but really listening and validating how a person feels, right? Letting them know that you can empathize, right? Understand where they're coming from. You
Right.
understand why they feel the way that they feel, right?
Mhm.
And then holding space also means that you should ask that person how you can best support them, because that may differ depending on that individual, your relationship, the situation. So ask, how can I best help you in this situation? What can I do? And sometimes all it means is sitting with someone and being present. Before COVID, we were holding hands and hugging each other. We may not do that as much right now. But I think we miss that, right? We miss that skin to skin touch. And I think it's adding to our stressors a little bit. And you can also hold space for yourself, right? Sometimes people think about that through some kind of meditation, mindfulness, for example, can do that.
Yeah, I really love this idea, and that's why when we were thinking about what do we call this conversation, is just
Mhm.
let's introduce this concept of holding space and
Yeah.
thinking of ways that we can not only model it just in a conversation here and creating an opportunity for people to ask us questions in the chat or tell us what they need in the chat, but also thinking of ways that we can show up for one another and we can show up for ourselves. I know personally, I don't think it's even enough to say it's been a rough few weeks or months or year. Like the time is getting away from me. I think rough is such an understatement
Mhm.
that it's kind of to the point where, I almost wish I could call my therapist as much as I call you, right? But that's not cost effective.
Yeah.
It's not something that I can really do. And she has a whole roster of clients who are eating up her time just as much as I am. But I do feel like I wish there was a way someone could hold space for me or I could hold space for myself almost every day. The pervasiveness of violent images and the stories of hate, just hearing them over and over again online and everywhere I turn. I feel like some days I wake up and I'm so angry. I'm so on fire. I want to go change the world. We took to the streets in the summer. You want to make signs and protest and build coalitions around all of the things that we're really mobilizing on. But then there are other days where I'm just so overwhelmed. I'm so heartbroken at this state of the world that I want to stay in bed. And I feel like, man, I can't even get this roller coaster of emotions under control. I feel like it keeps surprising me how to respond in this moment.
Yeah, I completely understand, Felicia, and I really appreciate how you advocate for therapy. All I can say is yes, yay, therapy. Um, and, and things have been so hard lately for most people, right? And what you're explaining really sounds like how trauma manifests itself in you, right?
Mhm.
And when most people think about trauma, they think about these really big events, right? They think about war, some kind of devastating hurricane, those types of things. But for most of us, when we're experiencing trauma, it's in these little everyday events, right? These smaller things that pile up on top of each other and eventually impact us psychologically, behaviorally, emotionally, right? And we, do things like we eat way too much or we don't eat at all, right? It just depends,
Both.
depending, right, on the
Right.
situation. Or like you don't eat anything healthy, right? But you eat like a whole bag of Twizzlers. So when we see videos of people being killed that remind us of our friends, family, ourselves, this puts another smaller trauma on top of our already very stressful lives. Some researchers will talk about this in terms of racial trauma. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like, just being able to say this is traumatic, right? Like I'm with you. I just finished writing a book that'll come out in the fall and it's about family trauma. Yeah, and it's like it's so easy to tell stories. So many of us identify with family trauma or we can say certain events were traumatic and people will say, "Oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you." They understand and they immediately empathize with you. But at the same time, it feels like what we're living through is so traumatic. Looking at these images and in these videos, and we need to be able to say, this too is traumatic, right? And this too is causing as much harm to me as a bad thing that happened to me, or this traumatic, chaotic event that everyone will say after Harvey, hey, let's all just take a couple days and think about what we've lived through. But we don't create the same space for this ongoing, just this onslaught. And it almost feels like for some of us, there's no way to avoid being traumatized, right? And I'm thinking especially about members of the groups that Dr. Robertson, listed off, people who are being targeted right now, Black people, Latinx folks, Asian Americans. I mean, that's not an exhaustive list, but it feels like almost everywhere you turn, you're being inundated with images of something traumatic happening to people who either look like you or share similar experiences.
Yeah. So, Felicia, as a media scholar, can you spend some time helping us understand the various ways that
Mm.
these events of racial violence are impacting us when we absorb them through the media or other ways?
Oh, yeah, that's such a good question. And if I may, I'll even hop over into professor mode for just a moment because I think it's probably a lot of, this is my area of research and what I study, and probably that heightened awareness makes me experience things even more. But I taught a special topics course in the fall that was called Black Twitter and Beyond. And the textbook that we used, of course, it was a journalism text, but it was talking specifically about Black storytellers and content creators of this generation. And almost by default, a lot of the Black storytellers and content creators end up reporting on police brutality and racial violence and other, forms of systemic oppression that we see play out in society because the mainstream media won't tell those stories, right? And so in the text, it was called Bearing Witness While Black. The author, who is another colleague of mine, Professor Alyssa Richardson, explains that, we witness these sort of historical events in four ways. One, we're there. We're there in the moment. We're sharing the time and the space. And this is considered pretty much the strongest form of witness. The second way that we witness events is through live transmission. So maybe we're not in the same space, but we're sharing the same time. Something that's happening simultaneously. If you think about 9/11, we can probably, most of us, remember the time where we all had our TVs on watching in real time the World Trade Towers fall before our eyes. And it was very powerful. We weren't in the same space, but we were experiencing it at the same time. The third way is historicity. And this is a way that you might go back and visit the same space, but in a different time. In fact, if we go with the 9/11 conversation, oftentimes when I'm in New York, I've never been to the One Trade Tower because people always say if you go to that monument, it's such a heavy, somber feeling because you're sharing the same space of such a horrific event that we all witnessed, right? And then the fourth way that we witness events is through a recording. So you might have a book or a video, and this is an artifact that does not share the same time or space with the actual event. And so if you're hearing that, you might think, well, sharing a video or a recording, you're not there at the time or the space, so it's not as powerful or it's not a strong form of witness. But what Professor Richardson argues or really explains in the book is that, for those of us who are being targeted, for those of us who share lives and similarities with those who we see being targeted, in fact, when we watch a recording, it feels almost like being there. And it feels almost like a live transmission because of our shared vulnerability. Because we know when we look at George Floyd, or for me, an Adam Toledo, who was a 13-year-old boy, and I have a 13-year-old son next door right now in school, I'm instantly thinking about that can be my son, that can be my husband, future husband, that can be, we think our daughters, we think that can be our wives, it could be me, it could be our lives. And she calls that the weighty baggage. So she says, there is this weighty baggage of being Black or being marginalized or targeted that we experience just from witnessing this stuff. And so maybe that's why I'm feeling things so heavily, but could you talk a little bit about the toll that this sort of weighty baggage might take on people?
Yeah, it's really interesting that a lot of what you're talking about as a media scholar like resonates with how clinical psychologists talk about
Mhm.
PTSD, like post-traumatic stress disorder, and the different types of exposure of trauma that can have impact on you. So this is real traumatic, these are real traumatic events in a lot of people's lives, right? And this idea of weighty baggage is really important because it can impact people in a variety of different ways. Researchers are really primarily focused on Black people because of the amount of violence focused on or towards Black people, but I'm sure that other people of color are experiencing these stressors as well. One of the main things that I've seen research on is really this impact on the psychological and physical health of individuals as they experience these things, like to the point where Black people are taking more sick days when these events happen, right? They're too angry, too sad, too hopeless, too just overwhelmed to go to work, right? And sometimes those emotions can worsen the physical ailments that they may already have, right? So this is going to, if you have a chronic illness like diabetes, these types of stressors are going to make that flare up. And we know that we have higher rates of diabetes in African American communities anyway. So these types of events are really impacting the health of Black people. They're also resulting in fear. And a lot of that fear is towards police officers. There's fear and there's mistrust. If you're driving down the street, you shouldn't be afraid when you see a police car, right? That shouldn't spark a fear reaction. But it's to the point where a lot of times Black people are hesitant to call the police when there's an emergency because they're unsure of whether or not that is the best plan for them or whether it's safe, right? And so that's a very, very difficult position to put people in. For myself, I have an 8-year-old son. He's going to be humongous, and I already know this, and I'm thinking there are people that are going to be afraid of him because of his size and the color of his skin, but he's the sweetest child in the world, like he would
Yes.
never hurt anyone. Now my daughter, she might be another story. But how much do I tell him? How do I guide him to be safe and live in a world where there could potentially be racial violence towards him, but at the same time protect his innocence? It's a lot for people to bear.
It's so much, and I think you're really touching on kind of like this tension that we live in where there's fear and there's also courage. Like we're thinking of ways that we can defend ourselves and protect ourselves at the same time, right? And for me, I think about again being a media scholar and even that very same class that I taught. I'm very passionate about alternative journalism and alternative media and empowering students to know the power that they have, that they can put a pretty good quality, camera in their pocket and document and tell their stories in a way that mainstream media never allowed. But then you think about the stories that we end up documenting and thinking about even the brave bystander that Dr. Robertson mentioned, Darnella Frazier. She was only 17 years old at the time that she filmed over 9-minute interaction that was extremely violent with George Floyd, resulting in his death. And then you have all of us, who are kind of bystanders in a way, who, even though you kind of want to walk away and protect yourself from stuff, also thinking about we have to help amplify, circulate, draw attention to these messages. We want these stories to be told because for so long people didn't believe us, and some people actually need evidence in order to believe us, or people just weren't even interested in these stories. So you have this tension of fear and also courage. And so, I know there's been a lot of attention online around ways that we can support Darnella Frazier. I know there was a GoFundMe set up for her because everyone's so invested in her mental health and how she's going to recover from this moment. But there are so many of us, like I just said, other bystanders who really understand the gravity of documenting and being a witness to this racial violence. So I'm curious, I know we're not in a clinical setting, but I'm curious, what kind of advice would you give to someone like Darnella or to any of the brave bystanders who may be, tuning in right now and have been a witness to a horrific event or some sort of racial violence like this?
Yeah, that's a really important question, Felicia. And there's not really one clear answer. But
Mhm.
I would say that the first thing that we all have to do is really check in with ourselves,
Yeah.
figure out that way that you can see how you're doing, if that includes prayer, meditation, journaling, or just a moment where you think, how do I feel in this moment? Am I okay? Um, and that's an important step to take before rushing into action. Many of us feel that we have to do something, right? Like our first, I have to do something is the first instinct. We might say, we got to watch the video, right? Or I have to read the article or whatever it is. I personally don't, I choose not to watch the video. That's not something that I personally can handle. And I know that, but I want to keep educated. So I will often read articles. Sometimes people feel like they have to share it, right? Like I have to repost, or people may use their social media platform to engage in activism, right? There are so many things that you can do, but you can also choose to do nothing, or just to choose to take care of yourself, right? So we have to be able to make that choice, that it's okay to take care of ourselves and not be an activist, to not be a part of the social media spread. Because sometimes if you just keep acting and acting without really thinking about it, it can become overwhelming. Some scholars talk about that as racial battle fatigue, right? And that's this idea that you can become just exhausted from engaging in combating oppression and racism. It's hard work. So we have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves. So for example, like last week when the verdict happened, the first thing I did was check in with myself. Like, how do you feel? And realizing that I was optimistic, but still had some anger. But I was like, okay, but I'm okay. I'm okay. And so after I did that, I texted you because I knew we had been dealing with this. And I was like, Felicia's feeling something right now. So I text you. And then after that, I posted on social media, right? But it's important that the first thing that I did was check in with myself to make sure that I was okay. We can't care for others if we haven't taken care of ourselves. So, and really what I'm talking about is self-care, right? And we can't forget about it. It needs to be as regular as brushing our teeth, eating meals. It has to be a part of our everyday practice all the time, but especially when we're in times of stress or struggle. We have to engage in behaviors intentionally, right? So you must intentionally make choices to take care of yourself, psychologically, emotionally, physically. What are you doing to make sure that you feel good? And we have to make these choices even when it seems like the world is spinning and and there's a lot going on. We still have to learn to really engage in taking care of ourselves. I would suggest putting self-care time on your schedule, like an assignment or a meeting, so that you're checking and you're making sure that you're doing this for yourself every day. So, Felicia, in light of thinking about taking care of ourselves, can you talk a little bit about ways to monitor social media exposure to racially traumatic events?
Yes, yeah, that's a good question. I curate my social media as a form of self-care. And I like to think of it almost as the inverse of what you said, right? I'm a media scholar, so I know I do this for a living. I love social media. I write papers on it. I know all the positive things, but on the flip side, I know all the negative things as well. Well, most of them, some of them we haven't probably discovered yet. The negative consequences. So when you ask the question, what are you doing for yourself to make you feel well or to feel better? I tend to think of it as, what are the things that I'm doing that are not making me feel better, that are kind of making me feel worse? And so oftentimes I can really pinpoint how the answer to that question is something related to social media or being online. And so I am very kind of proactive. I think some of my students are often a little bit surprised because here I am teaching about social media, and then they ask me a question and I'm like, oh no, I haven't seen that. I haven't looked at that. I really guard my experience online. And I'll give you an example. Back when, around the time when Philando Castile's murder was streamed live on Facebook, I decided to deactivate my Facebook altogether. I was like, this is it. There's enough of that. The Facebook algorithm, it really prioritizes visual images and video content. So as soon as you log in, at least that's how it was a couple years ago, you get all of this content right at the top of your feed. And all of this conversation around whatever is trending, it just inundates you. And I felt like it was too overwhelming. So I decided to just deactivate Facebook altogether. I also have activated screen time boundaries on my phone. So I have an iPhone, but I'm sure other devices are just as capable. And it sends me an alert when I reach the allotted time. And that's a reminder for me to, hey, maybe I should quit scrolling and get up, go, check on my kid, go for a walk, go play with the dog, just do something other than constantly consuming all of this information, especially if it's information that's causing me to not feel well, right? And so even I know those are maybe a little bit extreme, and some people may not be willing or able to limit their time online, but my advice would be to just get really familiar with the settings in whatever social media content that you are engaging in, whatever platform it is. For example, on Twitter, I love Twitter. I also love the mute function on Twitter. I will go in and mute a hashtag so fast so that once it starts trending, it does not show up on my feed. You can also mute a phrase. So I got to be honest with you. Over the past year, COVID-19, coronavirus, anything related to that, I muted it on my timeline because I'm well informed. I don't want to be reminded of everything that's happening every 5 minutes. So I mute it. I also take the liberty and exercise my right to unfollow or block anyone who shares images of police brutality, racial violence, things of that nature. I understand and I really appreciate the decision to amplify and circulate certain things for certain people. But I know that those images, like you said earlier, Stacie, they are not for me. I am a Black woman. I am a mother to a Black son. I have Black people that I love. I don't need to see images of them being gunned down in the streets in order for me to believe that these things actually happen. And so I just make use of that. A last thing that I do, even on my iPhone, is that I eliminate all push notifications. And this was so helpful for me, even in the beginning of the pandemic. I don't know, it feels so long ago, but I don't know if you remember when all of this stuff was rapidly developing with COVID-19, it felt like there was a push notification coming every minute. This is what's happening in Italy, Venezuela, CDC says this, the WHO says that. And I was just, it felt almost like I was paralyzed. So I went through and I disabled all of my push notifications. Nothing is getting pushed to me. I make a dedicated time when I go and seek out information. And that really changed the game for me. For me, I take a couple of minutes in the morning, 10 to 15 maybe, and browse the headlines. And then I do it right before prayer and meditation or morning walk so that I do have that time to then sit with and reflect with everything that I just consumed. And I'm not constantly being inundated throughout the day. But I also want to say, even though I do all of those things, I still channel so much of my work into the work we do here at the Center for Critical Race Studies. I, fuel my passion in other ways to move the dial on systemic oppression in intangible ways. I feel like I do everything I can. But even when I put those boundaries around protecting myself and making sure that I feel well, I can't help but fight off those feelings of guilt. And I know that you touched on that a little bit already, where you said you don't have to be the activist, but at the same time, I think to myself, there will never be enough, right? It's so easy to feel like, especially after the last week we had, that there will never be enough. I can't do enough. There's so much more work that has to be done. And I get so guilty around even putting those boundaries for myself because I'm thinking while you're, caring for yourself, someone else is getting gunned down in the street. And so those are really difficult feelings for me to work through, and those are the times where I'm really grateful for my therapist. Again, another plug, I should have invited her. But I'm wondering, what kind of advice would you give to those who are joining us today who kind of share that sentiment, who are really overwhelmed by just trying to be a positive force in the world that seems really overwhelmingly dark right now?
Yeah. First, I want to say thank you for those tips, Felicia. So I will be muting some hashtags. If I
Do
can't
it.
figure it out, I'll give you a call.
Yes.
Um, but I mean, I think you're right. And I think there are a lot of people that feel that guilt when they're like, I should be ready for the fight. I should be ready for the
Mhm.
struggle, right? But I mean, this really just takes us right back to self-care. You cannot be a very good activist if you don't have the energy, you don't have the vision, you're not your best self when you're tired and you don't feel well. You're not going to be able to put your effort into it. And really, when we're thinking about self-care, you have to go beyond the bare minimum, which are just your needs. You need to push through to finding those places where you can bring pleasure and joy into your life without guilt. So even when these terrible things are happening around you, you have to find a place, excuse me, to be able to find joy in your life, because this is the world. Terrible things will happen, but you're not going to be able to fight them and combat them if you don't see the beauty in life, right? If you don't see the wonderful things in the world, you're not going to have the motivation, desire to do that. So you have to take care of yourself. It's the first step to really making genuine change. So take care of yourself first, fight the battle second, right? And I'm a fan of really thinking about and planning ahead the types of activities that work for you. Think about really making sure you have someone that you can ask for help, right? When you are struggling, someone you can talk to. Create a village around yourself to support you. And a village can be one person. That's honestly all you need, is one person that you can go to and talk to when you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed. And then you can get some of that off of you, and then you can be back, ready to be back in activism mode. I also like self-focused activities on gratitude, taking time to just, I don't know, I have like probably at least 5 journals that say things like be happy or something like that. And so,
Yeah,
and just
same,
in,
same.
so just kind of writing out those things that I have to be grateful for. And as you do that, it's such an important reminder. And as you do that, you feel good about your situation. And then you're like, okay, these are the things that everybody should have. Let's get back in the fight to make sure that other people are doing well. Make a list of activities you enjoy, so you don't have to think about it, right? Because sometimes in those overwhelming times, you're like, I don't even feel like doing anything,
All of
right?
it.
But if you have a list already and you're like, yes, I know that going for a walk works for me.
Mhm.
The other day, I put a blanket out in my backyard because it was so beautiful outside, and laid in the grass and read and looked up through the trees. And it was so beautiful. And I was like, how long have I lived in this house? And I have never done this. And so this is now going on my list.
Yeah.
Blanket in the backyard, lay in the grass, look through the trees, read, whatever, enjoy beauty. And so just really pushing yourself to try new things and take care of yourself. It's really important um, to do these things and let go of the guilt, because it's not helping anything. And if you take 6 months off, a year off, it's okay, right? It's okay. You got to take care of yourself.
Yeah. I I really like that idea of making a list. I need to work on that because I am the person when I'm super overwhelmed, I just like Uber Eats some good food and I get back in the bed because I just forget, like you said. So I'm taking notes. And I'm also thinking about not only just taking notes for myself, but I'm thinking about taking notes for my students and how I can show up better for the different spheres of influence that I have. How can I be a better professor? Thinking about if it's difficult for me right now to show up and I'm actually getting paid to show up and I don't want to show up, how challenging it must be for students who are working, who are learning, many of whom are taking care of their families and doing so many different things, in particular over the course of the past year. I think about the committees that I serve on and ways that I can try to figure out, hey, let's stop for a moment now and get ourselves together so we can get back to the work and be stronger and better. And I think that's so important that we're leading with empathy, right? In this moment and realizing that we're all dealing with this. We're all trying to figure out how to make it from one day to the next. And I think it's so important to really touch on this idea of leading with empathy. If you have advice, not just for, professors, but people who are on the call who are in leadership positions, supervisors, right? Administrators, committee chairs, wink, wink, committee chairs, right? What advice would you give about leading with empathy?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that many of us are leaders without knowing it or thinking about it. So I don't want anybody, listening here to check out because they're like, I'm not a leader, right? But often, we're leader amongst our friends, we lead our children, we may be leaders in our community. So really, I'm sure there are instances where most people are leaders in some way.
Mhm.
Um, and say the next thing I will go back to, and if you don't get anything out of this time, you will know that you have to take care of yourself. But that's the first step, right? Take care of
Good.
yourself first. Make sure you're all right. Because when you're in a bad mood and you don't feel very well, you are probably not your best self with other people, right?
Not at all.
You're not very empathetic to other people. You don't give grace because you don't feel good. So take care of yourself so that you can kind of pass on that grace and peace to other people. The other thing I would say is really be authentic and true to who you are. For me, that means that I check in on people. I ask people how they're doing, and I don't want the "oh, I'm fine," which is the answer that most people give. But
Mhm.
sometimes I will ask, like, no, how are you really doing? I had a meeting with a colleague yesterday, and he just did not look like himself in the meeting. And so afterwards, I just sent him a quick email that said, "Hey, I'm just checking in on you to make sure you're okay. You looked a little down in the meeting." And he responded back that, he was just stressed, right? A little tired, but he was so grateful just for that quick check-in, right? So really engage in focusing on others in some ways, right? How are they doing? Check in and see how they are. The other thing that I really think is valuable, and part of the reason probably why I love you so much, is the use of humor, right? Because if you cannot laugh, it lifts so much off of you.
Mm,
So when appropriate, right, use humor, right, to engage with people. At least that's what I do, because that's me, right? But think about who you are and what you bring to the table, and use that to connect with other people. I think that's a really important thing for a leader, so that you don't feel like there's this huge hierarchy where the people that you are working with feel like they can't communicate or connect with you, right? So have grace, assume other people are doing their best, right? Don't like just say, oh, they're lazy, they're just not. Assume other people are doing their best. We know this is a hard time. And then also in doing that, let people know that you have high expectations for them, that
right.
that they can achieve things and do well. Give them a gentle push, right? But don't push them so hard that they break, right? You have to check in like, hey, I see that you didn't get this done. How much more time do you think you need to get it done?
Right.
And try to make work on a compromise. Like, don't just push your will onto them, but work with people where they are, um, so that you can really formulate a plan that's viable, something that's really going to work, and leave that other person feeling heard and appreciated and valued. That's really, really very important. And then I'd say just make sure you're validating people's experiences, their feelings, and make sure you're holding space for them.
Yeah. I That's so perfect. It's such a good answer because, I feel like whenever these events happen, and I do find time to go on social media, or I'm, trending or whatever, a lot of the conversation is always, how do people expect us to show up tomorrow? How are they, your coworker is still sending you that email. Your boss is still demanding you to do this thing, or your professor. I see students who talk about their professors still, drilling in on them to get this done by midnight. And it's like, we just saw a verdict and now we're already seeing a teenage girl, being gunned down. Like, how do you expect me to just show up? And it's not that I can't do what you've asked me to do. It's that I just need a moment in order to do it well. And I really appreciate, this idea of just giving people a little wiggle room. I think that's been the craziest thing about this pandemic, is that so many of us, self included, have built a home office and just kept pummeling straight through so much of a difficult time. And it means so much when someone reaches out, like when you reached out to me last week and you were like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "No, girl, I'm outside Panera crying." Outside of Panera looking crazy, crying, watching the verdict come in on my phone. But it was a good prompt and a reminder that we're human. And then you checked on me, and then someone else walked by and they, "Oh, is that the case?" And I was like, we're human, we're all connected. And then I checked in on my student. And so leading with empathy, I think, is just really important to keep in mind right now, and the trickle down kind of benefit that it has when we can all help each other. But I'm going to stop talking. I have to stop talking now because I see that we have some questions in the Q&A, I think. And I think Dr. Robertson is going to help us navigate them. I know I could keep talking to you like all day long about this stuff, self-care and social justice. So Dr. Robinson, are you here to help us?
Of course, my sister, I am always here to help. Again, we want to first of all say an amazing job, my sisters, an amazing job. Thank you so much for leading us in this in-depth conversation. Our audience members are incredibly engaged, and they bring us a plethora of questions that they'd like for you to entertain. One of them situates itself at the beginning of your conversation, where you mentioned that trauma occurs through little and large things. So how does this trauma manifest itself in our jobs and in our schoolwork? And how do we hold space or create solace in these demanding and inopportune moments?
That's a really good question. And it's not one with an easy answer because people are different, right? And so some people, when they get in the midst of stress, they go full work mode, like they immerse themselves in work, they become perfectionists, right? And they're chugging through, and everybody else is like, "Oh, that's great," right? They're doing all these things. This is wonderful, but they're exhausting themselves in the process, right? They're gonna burn out. And then other people lay in bed all day because they're like, I can't, And so it really can manifest itself in like the whole range in between. A lot, I know I've seen like with a lot of my students, like they're just like, I really wanted to get this assignment done, but I just could not get it together. And so this has probably been a semester where I've accepted more late work than any other time in my life, because I'm like, I understand, it's hard. And so when students reach out and say, "Hey, I need some extra time because, I'm dealing with this, and this," and I'm like, "Okay, yes, I completely understand." So these different types of trauma really can manifest themselves in our behavior and can even go so far as to cause psychological disorders, right? And I want to go back to my plug for therapy. I mean, I think it's a valuable thing. I think people should have mental health checkups every year, just like they have physical checkups, because life is is a lot, you know. And so I think that, you know, our students should make better use of the counseling services on campus. And, you know, even employees have access to counseling through the university. So I think that's another thing. Like, if you are concerned that this trauma is building up in you and you are not your normal self, that's really the clue, right? Are you behaving in ways that are different from how you normally act? Then maybe it's worth checking in with a therapist to get you back on track.
And you know what? I'll just add, it's such a good idea to check in with a therapist because they will help you really figure out, being able to name, just like Stacie did earlier in the conversation, hey, this is trauma, right? And then also being able to come up with a plan for dealing with it. And so for me, my therapist she's given me permission. It's so funny. My friend and I joke about it. We call it taking to the bed. So she gives me permission to say, I'm taking to the bed. And my son knows it, my family knows it. If I say I'm taking in bed, it means I'm ordering Uber Eats and I'm getting in my bed. But we put a time window on it. And that's always our check-in. I'm taking to bed for the rest of the day. And if I don't feel better tomorrow, then we know something, you know, like I'm taking to bed for the weekend. But if that doesn't help me be more prepared by Monday, then now we might need to check in again and see if it's something even greater to deal with. So just take to bed and have a plan.
Wow, such beautiful comments, my sisters. You really allow us to imagine that equity in this search for justice can't simply be for the outside, that we have to apply it to ourselves, that we have to give a little bit of grace to ourselves, and that we have to seek out the things that we need for ourselves. And especially as people of color, we often move away from, and we find ourselves hesitant to seeking out that psychological, emotional help that we all need in these very trying times. Dr. Harris, one of our audience members, offers this implied question. She says, Breonna Taylor still affects me today. Because we were the same age and we shared many of the same experiences, Miss Taylor did nothing wrong, but she was still murdered in a horrifying way. Our audience members mentions that she's just tired. She's just overwhelmed. Would you speak to that, Dr. Harris?
Yeah, I mean, all I could say is to whoever wrote that question is I see you and I feel you, I am you. Breonna Taylor's case and also Oluwatoyin hit me last summer very hard. Breonna's birthday is just a couple of days before mine in June. And so when my birthday came, it was really hard for me to celebrate. It was hard for me to celebrate having another year, knowing that Breonna was just taken from us in the way that she was. But then I thought to myself, I might have to bring out my tissue, but you know, I thought to myself, this is what makes for us, I can only speak for Black women, every birthday and every triumph so much sweeter. Because I know that I just retweeted a poem on Twitter yesterday where it says, every day something has tried to kill me and it has failed. And so I would just say, I see you. It is a hard space. It is heartbreaking. But for me, I think no one benefits from us wallowing in pain and not living our life to the fullest, especially if they've already transitioned on. And so the best way that we can honor our ancestors and those who have transitioned is by living our life to the fullest and taking every opportunity for joy that we are presented with and grabbing it and refusing to let go, because the world out there wants you to, and we're gonna say no, right? So I get it, girl, but have a good day, do something for yourself, and make that list that Dr. DeFreitas was talking about and find ways to care for yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Such a beautiful, insightful answer. Dr. DeFreitas, one of our audience members asked, how do we ask our village, our supporters, for permission to share our pain, our trauma, and our sorrow without overwhelming them?
Yeah, that is a really good point. I think one thing that you have to do is it is nicer to have a larger village, right? So you're coming to the same person every time. But I think a lot of times we can lean on each other at the same time. You know what I'm saying? Like take care of each other, hear each other in the same moment. Um, I found that, at the beginning of the pandemic, my husband was watching a lot of CNN and wanting to have a lot of conversations about COVID-19. And I just told him, I can't do it every day. I was like, we can have 3 days a week. And and I was very clear about it. I was like 3 days a week, not consecutive, and we can have these conversations. Right. So really like talking with people honestly about like sharing what you can bear. Hopefully the people in your village can also do the same, right? Open it up for conversation. Like, hey, I have this thing I need to talk about, I want to talk about, but I don't want to overwhelm you. Just be out there. Can we engage with this? Can we talk about it on Sunday nights? Like, let's say on Sunday nights we have a check-in time or something like that. So I think the most important part of this is really open communication with those people that you engage with, so that you have a good understanding about what they can deal with, and then everybody has their own individual therapist, so that helps too, right? So
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. Um, our friends and our colleagues are wonderful advocates and allies for the hardships that when we endure. This question, of course, is to the both of you. How do we take care of our myriad responsibilities as faculty members? And then another question was, as students whose professors don't quite understand, when the amount of stress and trauma is overwhelming and often crushing us inside.
which part you want to take, Felicia?
Oh, that, yes. Dr. Harris.
The first thing that came to my mind is, am I doing that well? I think honestly, this is a time, we're living in a time where we also have to advocate for ourselves. I think one of the really interesting things that have shifted since George Floyd is that now we have just this blurring of personal and professional and industry and political in ways that didn't quite exist before. And so I don't think, one of the things I did last year was that's my dog, sorry. I actually found articles to share with my colleagues, and I said, hey, here's something you might consider. I think I took the lead from Dr. Kashima Murray, who had out of office message during the summer and said, like, I'm really going through some things right now. This is a tough time. Here are some articles for you to read about what your Black colleagues are going through. And I don't think, it's not confrontational, it's not political. It just is what it is, to be able to say, hey, I don't know if you've been watching the news, because sometimes our people are not watching the news. It doesn't directly impact them. They may not know, but this thing happened yesterday and I need some time. And I also appreciate when my students come to me that way, because I'm like, I get it. I get it. This happened and it was hard for me. I'm having a day where I need to take to the bed. I'll get back to you tomorrow. And I think hopefully if we have a respectful workplace like we think we have, that your colleagues and your professors will be able to understand that and extend some grace.
Yeah, I think those are good points, Felicia. I'd say like to faculty to really think about what you cannot do. Like, I think we always feel like we have to do everything. And sometimes you do have to take a break. There may be a meeting that you just don't go to, right? It doesn't mean you're not participating, right? Maybe you send some notes ahead of time. Hey, I read this. Here are my thoughts on this. I won't be able to attend. And I think that's fine to take time for ourselves. We just keep pushing on. A lot of us, some of us don't take time off. I can't understand the faculty who teach like the long semesters and then the May mini and the winter mini. And so I was like, no, I would go crazy. Like you need a break. And so just making sure that you are finding time to really take some time off. Because you're going to burn out if you keep teaching and keep teaching. And so that would be what I suggest. Take some small time for yourself back when you need it, and then make sure you're taking a break during the year. I know maybe you've taught the class 10 times. You're like, oh, I've taught it 10 times. It's easy. I don't have to think about it. Yes, you do. You do have to think, you have to be on. And so you have to give yourself a little bit of time off, a little bit of time.
Well, my sisters, thank you for those insightful questions. We just have a few more before our time expires. If you would, Dr. DeFreitas, could you speak to what are some of the resources that managers and leaders, supervisors can refer to, or even professors, to help with leading with empathy, with
Right.
offering the kind of holding space and being thoughtful about the people that we lead and we serve?
Right. I think there are probably lots of different resources. The APA, like if you go to apa.org, they have so many different resources available on the website for people who are not members of APA. And so that would be one place that I would say to definitely go and check out some ideas about how to engage in this type of leadership. Um, I would say also to talk with your colleagues, about the things that they're doing, the choices they're making. Because you may feel like, oh, well, I have to hold this strict line, and I'm letting students get away with all this, and you're like, oh, other faculty are letting them get away with a lot more, right? Because their students need it. And so just really think about making sure, how can you engage in leading where you are tuned into not just how you feel and how you're interacting with other people, but getting a sense of how those you're working with are doing. Start your meetings with a check-in. How's everybody doing? Like, don't just start the work of the meeting. Let's chat a little bit. That's what we used to do when we were in person, right? At the beginning of the meeting, we'd check in, have a little bit of conversation. And I think a lot of us are missing that now. So just really having that time to say, well, how is everyone doing? Is there, anything exciting happened to anybody? Anything that, has been heavy on your heart that you guys want to share or talk about? So I think that there are little things that we can do. You don't have to read a whole book on it. But if you do want to read a book on it and you have some ideas about that, do email me. And I can send you some lists of some books and some articles. But I think that we just need to be more mindful of our own emotions and the emotions of other people.
Thank you very much, Dr. DeFreitas. Dr. Harris, earlier it was mentioned how difficult the parent-child conversations are to have in relation to racial equity and racial conflict in America. How would you suggest preparing African-American children for the everyday life of living in a Black body?
This is such a hard question. And then actually Stacie and I just talked about this over the weekend, and I was giving her my list. I was a teen mom, and I had my son living with me on campus at the University of Georgia, which is a predominantly white institution in the rural northeast of Georgia. And so I kind of got thrown into this because, research shows that Black kids and brown kids, kids of color experience racism at a very young age, as early as pre-K and kindergarten. And my son Amari was no exception. And so at that point, I really, started looking for books and resources and tools that I could share with him and just explain to him that there are differences in how people will perceive him and, Dylan. There are just complete differences. And one of the books we read was If You Were Alive at the Time of Martin Luther King. And it was just such a really good, we read it together page by page, working through it. And it just kind of explains the way things are without a lot of emotion, but just saying, this is what it is. This is the history, and this is what led us to this place. Amari and I have read so many books together, and he now reads YA books that are all centering the Black experience. So I would definitely say books are a great resource. I just participated in a parenting webinar last week, and I think that's something that's important to do as well, especially for parents of children today, because my son gets the alerts before I do, because I cut my alerts off, remember? So he'll come to me and say, this thing has happened. And so, it's important to reparent yourself and to really think of, like, my parents were not prepared for this. I got to do what I got to do to get myself ready to parent in 2021. And a part of that workshop really talked about just having that conversation with your kid, even before going in the grocery store. Hey, you can't grab the Skittles, right? You can't grab the Skittles because someone might think bad things when you grab the Skittles. I know Tommy has the Skittles, but let's try to make sure that we're not grabbing the Skittles, and not making him feel bad, about being Black, but just saying, some people are going to look at you and think when you grab the Skittles, they're thinking the worst. And so we want to avoid that. So I would just say get resources and tools, and just continue to look into educating yourself, because there's no easy way to have the conversation about an uneasy reality, right?
Yeah, I think
Thank
Felicia
you.
is bringing up really good points, and I think I also just want to one more second highlight that idea of building that racial pride, right? That's so important. So yes, prepare your child for racial barriers. I think unfortunately we have to do it, but if you can balance that with that racial pride, it works so much better, right? Because they know who they are, they love who they are, and they're ready, and they take that with them when they go out into the world.
Well, my sisters, my final question is to both of you. One of our Caucasian brothers and sisters asked this question: how can white colleagues move beyond bearing witness of the trauma of people of color in their daily lives to shouldering the burden and helping everyone collectively hold space and allow self-care? Dr. DeFreitas.
Well, I think one way to do that is just with the personal relationships that you have, right? So reach out to the people of color that you have personal relationships with and check in on them. Like, hey, I saw this happen. How are you doing? Let me know if you want to talk, right? Or whatever. Or what can I do to support you? How can I help you? Right? Just asking those questions of people that you already have that relationship with, I think is one important idea.
Excellent. Dr.
I,
Harris.
I think it's so important, if for allies to consider doing some of the things that, um, I'll speak for myself, Black people just don't want to do. So, for example, it is really tiresome to have to be the one to say, hey, a Black man was lynched last night. Can we not have a meeting? Right? If you know about it, and if you think that someone might be impacted by it, maybe you can make the suggestion. Maybe you can kind of stand in the gap sometimes and say, I don't think this is, maybe we should make this face-to-face meeting an email thread, or maybe we push it back for a day or so, because I know something traumatic happened. And not necessarily stepping in and say, I'm speaking on Felicia, she's probably over there crying right now. But just doing it in a way that, again, states reality. The reality is this thing happened last night, and I want to advocate and try to step in the gap and be an ally for my colleagues and my friends who may have been impacted by this. I think it just goes so far. And then it helps you feel seen and appreciated as a person of color, to just be able to know that someone else has my back and is concerned about my well-being and how I'm showing up, or that I may not be able to show up.
Dr. Harris, Dr. Kraft DeFreitas, we want to sincerely thank you. Thank you. I mean, you have provided us not only with a wealth of information, but a lot of tools and strategies to be able to cope with the trauma that we face each and every day. We celebrate not only your amazing accomplishments with the recent publishing of your book, but we are astounded at your steadfast resilience and your undying devotion to helping marginalized people find the empowerment that they so desperately seek. My audience members, to all my colleagues, to the students, community partners, faculty and administrators, to my beloved staff members from all over our beloved UHD, we want to sincerely thank you for joining us today. It has been a blessing and an honor to serve you in this capacity, and we want to remind you that self-care is important. As our sisters told us, hold space, hold a little bit of tranquil space in a world of chaos for yourselves, because the long arch of justice is long, and we must have the endurance and the capacity to continue this earnest search for equity and justice for all. As our sister Toni Morrison would say, the function of freedom is to free others. And it is that mantra that we have built the Center for Critical Race Studies. It is for that reason that we are always striving as faculty members to do our best for our students. It is this very notion of social justice that informs and inspires the mission of our university. So on behalf of the fellows of the Center for Critical Race Studies, we thank you for your time with us today, and we ask that you please take care of yourself and take care of each other as we continue the work that justice requires. God bless you all, and we will see you soon.